the rancher who gave water to his Apache enemies and changed history forever. John Carter had lived on the plains of Arizona all his life. The land was wide and open, stretching as far as the eye could see, with rolling hills, rocky outcrops, and endless stretches of dry grass that shimmered gold in the hot sun. The air was crisp in the morning, filled with the scent of sagebrush and earth warmed by sunlight. To many, it seemed like a harsh place to live. The sun could be merciless, storms could appear without warning, and water was always precious. But to John, it was home. He loved the land for its beauty and its challenges. It tested him, yes, but it also gave him a sense of freedom he could not find anywhere else. From the time he was a boy, John had learned the ways of the land. He could read the sky like a book, knowing when storms would come or when the heat would make the soil too dry for planting. He knew every ridge, every hidden creek, every patch of grass where his cattle could graze safely. People in the nearby towns admired his knowledge and skill, often coming to him for advice on how to survive in the unforgiving desert. But John was not proud or boastful. He shared his wisdom freely because he believed that knowledge was meant to help people, not to make them feel small. Life as a rancher was not easy. Every day was full of work, from tending the cattle to fixing fences, to making sure there was enough feed and water. Sometimes the work felt endless, and there were days when the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. The droughts were the worst. During those times the grass dried up, the streams disappeared, and even the strongest cattle struggled to survive. Yet John never gave up. He believed that hard work, combined with patience and understanding of the land, could overcome almost any obstacle. John's neighbors were a mix of settlers and Native Americans, particularly the Apache tribes who roamed the nearby lands. The relationship between the settlers and the Apache had always been tense. There had been conflicts over land and resources for years, and many people lived in fear of raids or attacks. John, however, was different. He did not see the Apache simply as enemies. He saw them as people trying to survive in the same harsh land that he did. He had spent time learning their ways, observing their hunting techniques, understanding their knowledge of plants and water sources. To him, they were not threats. They were teachers and fellow humans navigating a difficult life. Despite his kindness, John knew that many people did not trust the Apache. They warned him to be careful, to keep his distance, and to protect his property at all costs. Some neighbors even whispered that he was foolish for believing in friendship and understanding. But John was not easily swayed by fear. He had learned early in life that fear could cloud judgment and prevent people from seeing the truth. He believed that courage was not just about defending oneself with a gun or standing up in a fight. True courage, he thought, was knowing when to act with kindness, even when others thought it was dangerous. One summer, the land suffered one of the worst droughts John had ever seen. The sun scorched the earth day after day, and the little creeks that had once provided water for both his cattle and the wildlife began to dry up. The grass turned brown and brittle, and the air seemed to shimmer with heat. The cattle grew restless, searching for water and shade. John worked from sunrise to sunset, digging troughs, moving the herd from one patch of grass to another, and praying that rain would come soon. The townspeople whispered that the drought would destroy the ranches and the farms. Many families feared losing everything they had worked for. During this difficult time, John noticed signs of the Apache nearby. He saw their tracks along the dried creek beds, heard the faint sound of horses in the distance, and occasionally glimpsed their figures moving carefully across the hills. He understood their struggle. Water was life, and the drought had put everyone in danger. Yet even as the tension in the region grew, John felt no fear toward them. Instead, he felt empathy. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him, that life was not only about protecting oneself, but also about helping others whenever possible. One afternoon, while John was repairing a fence near the edge of his property, he saw a small group of Apache warriors approaching. They were careful, moving slowly to avoid startling the cattle. Their eyes were wary, scanning the land for danger. John stood still, not reaching for a weapon. He waited, giving them space, and then spoke in a calm, respectful voice. "You are welcome here," he said. The Apache stopped, surprised by his words. They had expected hostility, perhaps even a fight, but instead they found openness. Slowly, one of the warriors stepped forward and nodded, accepting John's offer. This small act of courage and kindness marked the beginning of something remarkable. John allowed the Apache to use his water sources. He let them water their animals and even shared some of the food he had stored for the ranch. It was not a grand gesture by some standards, but in the harsh desert, it was a matter of life and death. As they drank and rested, a quiet understanding grew between them. John saw the gratitude in their eyes, and the Apache began to see that not all settlers were enemies. Over the following weeks, John and the Apache began to meet more often. They would sit together under the shade of an old mesquite tree, sharing stories about their families, the challenges of survival, and the harsh realities of life on the plains. John learned about the Apache's deep connection to the land, their knowledge of plants, animals, and water sources, and the traditions that guided their lives. He was fascinated by their bravery and resilience. In turn, the Apache learned about John's life as a rancher, his struggles with droughts and cattle, and his belief that kindness could overcome fear. The bond that grew between John and the Apache was quiet but powerful. It was built on trust, respect, and the understanding that both sides were struggling to survive in a harsh world. Neighbors watched with surprise. Some still whispered that John was foolish, but others began to wonder if there was another way to live, one that did not involve constant fear and conflict. John's actions showed that empathy and humanity could exist even in the most challenging circumstances. As the days turned into weeks, John noticed a subtle change in the land itself. Where the Apache had camped and rested, the soil seemed richer, the plants seemed stronger. Perhaps it was just coincidence, or perhaps it was the simple fact that cooperation created harmony. John realized that life on the plains was not only about survival, but also about relationships with people, animals, and the land itself. Every action, no matter how small, had consequences that could ripple through the lives of many. By the end of the summer, John's ranch had survived the drought better than many others in the area. His cattle were healthy, his fences intact, and his water troughs replenished. But more importantly, he had formed a bridge of trust between two communities that had long feared each other. What began as a simple act of offering water had grown into a symbol of understanding and courage. John knew that the challenges were far from over. The desert was unforgiving, and the world was full of dangers. But he also knew that with empathy, patience, and a willingness to see others as humans rather than enemies, even the harshest times could be faced with hope. And so, life continued on John Carter's ranch, under the scorching sun and the endless sky. He continued his work, tending his cattle and caring for the land, always aware of the delicate balance between survival and kindness. The Apache continued to visit, and slowly, the boundaries between settler and native began to blur. In a world often defined by conflict, John Carter stood as a quiet reminder that compassion could be a force stronger than fear. His story was only beginning, and the choices he made in that first summer of drought would echo far beyond the dusty plains of Arizona. The drought that had plagued the land for weeks continued to press down on John Carter's ranch. The sun blazed hotter than ever, and the soil cracked under its relentless heat. Even the little water in the creek seemed to vanish more quickly each day. The cattle were restless, pawing at the dry ground, searching for water that seemed harder and harder to find. John woke before sunrise each morning, walking the dusty paths between his pens, checking the water troughs and making plans for the day. Every decision mattered. Every choice could mean the difference between life and death for his animals, his land, and even for the people nearby. One morning, as he looked out toward the hills, John saw movement that made his heart race. A small group of Apache warriors was approaching once again. This time there was something different about them. They seemed cautious but tired, their horses thin and weary from the lack of food and water. The men slowed as they reached the edge of John's property, clearly unsure how he would react. John, however, stood calmly near his fence, his eyes steady and welcoming. He did not raise a weapon, did not shout or gesture for them to leave. Instead, he nodded and said softly, "You can come closer. The water is safe." The Apache paused for a long moment, their eyes scanning John's face for any sign of trickery or danger, but they found none. Slowly, one warrior stepped forward, his horse's hooves crunching in the dry dirt. The others followed, moving with caution but trust, drawn by the honesty they saw in John's eyes. It was a quiet, tense moment, filled with unspoken understanding. John could sense their fear, but he also sensed hope. They needed water, and he could give it to them without taking a risk to himself. To him, it was a simple choice, but one that would require courage and patience. John led them to a small spring that he had carefully dug and maintained for his cattle. The water was clear, cool, and life-giving. He showed them how to fill their containers and water their animals without wasting a drop. The Apache watched closely, respecting the care and thought John had put into this source. As they drank, their faces relaxed, and for a moment the tension of the desert seemed to lift. John could see gratitude in their eyes, and he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had not expected to become a hero or a legend, but he understood that helping others, even those who were once considered enemies, was the right thing to do. Over the next few days, the Apache returned several times. Each visit was cautious at first, but slowly trust grew. They began to talk with John, not just in gestures or short words, but in real conversation. He learned their names, their stories, and the hardships they faced in the dry, unforgiving desert. They spoke of the lands they had roamed, the families they had cared for, and the struggles to find water and food. John listened intently, asking questions and showing genuine interest. He wanted to understand them, not judge them. And in doing so, he discovered that they were not so different from himself. They loved their families, respected the land, and faced challenges every day, just as he did. The Apache began to share their knowledge as well. They taught John about hidden springs in the hills, where water could still be found even in the driest times. They explained how to identify plants that were safe to eat, how to track animals across long distances, and how to move silently through the desert without leaving evidence of one's path. John absorbed every detail, amazed by their wisdom and the way they had survived for generations in a land that others considered unforgiving. This exchange of knowledge strengthened their connection. John was no longer just a rancher helping strangers. He had become a friend and ally. One day, as John and the Apache sat together under the shade of a tall cactus, a young boy from the tribe approached timidly. His eyes were wide with curiosity, and he carried a small bundle of dried herbs. John smiled gently and invited the boy to sit. The child spoke little English, and John knew only a few words of the Apache language, but they communicated with gestures, smiles, and patience. The boy handed John the bundle, explaining through gestures that it was medicine for his cattle. John accepted it with gratitude, realizing that trust and friendship could exist even without words. It was a small moment, but it symbolized something much larger, a bridge between two worlds that had often feared and misunderstood each other. As the days turned into weeks, John's actions began to have an impact beyond his ranch. Other settlers began to notice his interactions with the Apache. Some were skeptical, whispering that he was taking too many risks or being too generous. Others, however, watched with admiration, realizing that his kindness had not led to harm, but to cooperation and peace. Slowly, the idea that the Apache were merely enemies began to change in the minds of some settlers. They saw that respect and understanding could replace fear and hostility. John did not seek recognition, but his actions spoke louder than any words. Meanwhile, the Apache shared John's story among their own people. They spoke of the rancher who had given them water without hesitation, who had treated them with respect and fairness. This tale spread, creating a reputation for John that extended far beyond his property. He became a symbol of what was possible when people chose empathy over conflict. And while he never sought fame or reward, the growing trust and goodwill around him helped make life on the plains a little safer and more hopeful for everyone. One afternoon, a particularly severe heat wave struck the region. The sun burned hot and merciless, and the cattle grew restless and thirsty. John worked tirelessly, moving the herd to shaded areas, ensuring that every animal had enough water to survive the day. The Apache arrived to help, bringing their own knowledge of the land. Together, they dug new troughs, guided the cattle to hidden water sources, and shared tasks without argument or hesitation. The collaboration was remarkable. It demonstrated that when people worked together, even the harshest conditions could be overcome. For John, it was proof that trust and cooperation were stronger than fear and mistrust. By the end of the week, the drought had taken a toll on everyone, but the bonds between John and the Apache had grown even stronger. They shared meals together, exchanged stories by the fire at night, and taught each other skills that could mean survival in the desert. John learned patience, humility, and a deeper understanding of resilience from the Apache. They learned that not all settlers were enemies, that compassion could exist even in a land known for struggle and conflict. It was a quiet revolution, one that would not be remembered in official histories or newspapers, but it changed lives in ways that mattered deeply. John often reflected on the small choices that had led to this connection. A decision to offer water, a willingness to listen, a respect for the lives of others, these were the acts that built trust and friendship. He understood that courage was not always about confrontation. Sometimes, it was about opening one's heart when fear and suspicion surrounded you. And in that moment, with the sun setting over the hills and the Apache and his cattle resting peacefully nearby, John felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known. He was not just surviving, he was helping others survive, and in doing so, he had created something far more valuable than land, cattle, or wealth. As summer continued, life on the ranch settled into a rhythm of cooperation. John and the Apache continued to meet daily, checking water sources, tending animals, and learning from each other. Their relationship became a model for what could happen when fear was replaced by understanding. Word of their friendship spread quietly, inspiring small acts of kindness and cooperation in neighboring communities. And though challenges remained, droughts, heat waves, and the ever-present threat of scarcity, John knew that they could face them together. By the end of that summer, John Carter had not only saved his ranch and cattle from the worst effects of the drought, but had also forged a lasting bond with the Apache. What began as a simple act of giving water had grown into a story of trust, empathy, and friendship. It was a story that would ripple through the desert, reminding all who heard it that kindness could change the course of life, even in the harshest of circumstances. John had proven that one person's courage and compassion could have far-reaching effects, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. Life on John Carter's ranch had settled into a steady rhythm, but the land remained as harsh and unpredictable as ever. The summer heat had finally begun to fade, leaving behind a dry, brittle landscape. The cattle were healthier, thanks to the cooperation between John and the Apache, but the challenges of the desert never truly disappeared. John had learned to read the signs of the land, but even his experience could not prepare him for everything. Yet, with the Apache as allies, he felt a new sense of confidence and hope that had been missing in previous years. The Apache warriors continued to visit regularly. They had become not just visitors but trusted partners in the daily struggle for survival. Together, they moved the cattle to hidden pastures, dug new water holes, and even repaired broken fences in ways John had never imagined. Their knowledge of the land was remarkable. They could find water where none seemed to exist, recognize plants that could nourish both humans and animals, and anticipate weather changes long before any signs appeared in the sky. John marveled at their wisdom and silently thanked the day he had chosen kindness over fear. Despite the growing trust, tensions in the region remained. Not all settlers were as open-minded as John. Some were suspicious of his friendship with the Apache, believing it was dangerous or foolish. They whispered rumors about alliances and secrets, warning John that his generosity might bring trouble. Others envied the ease with which he managed his ranch, thinking that he was receiving help unfairly. John ignored the gossip, focusing instead on the work at hand and the relationships he had built. He understood that fear often blinds people to what is possible, and he was determined not to let it limit him. One afternoon, John received word from a neighboring rancher about a group of outsiders approaching the area. They were not Apache but other settlers who had heard of the drought and were searching for resources. John knew that conflicts could arise quickly when food, water, and land were scarce. He also knew that this was an opportunity to show the power of cooperation. He called the Apache to his ranch, explaining the situation. Together, they devised a plan to share resources carefully and peacefully, rather than allowing fear or greed to ignite conflict. It was a delicate balance, requiring patience, diplomacy, and trust from all sides. The outsiders arrived, weary and desperate. Their eyes scanned the land suspiciously, unsure whether John would help or fight them. But John greeted them with calm hospitality, offering water and food. He introduced them to the Apache, showing that cooperation could be stronger than conflict. The newcomers were hesitant at first, still carrying the fear that had defined much of life on the plains. Yet, as they observed the respectful interactions between John and the Apache, they began to relax. They saw a community forming, not through fear or aggression, but through trust and empathy. Over the next few weeks, John became a mediator between the settlers and the Apache. He encouraged communication, showing both sides that understanding could replace suspicion. Small acts of kindness multiplied. Water was shared, fences were repaired together, and cattle were guided to pastures that could sustain them. These gestures seemed minor, but they built a foundation of trust that extended beyond John's ranch. People began to realize that cooperation was not a weakness but a strength. John had unknowingly sparked a quiet revolution in the desert, one that demonstrated the power of empathy and respect in a world often defined by conflict. During this time, John learned more about the Apache way of life. He observed how they hunted, how they prepared food, and how they taught the younger generation to survive with honor and care. He marveled at the deep respect they had for the land, the way they only took what they needed, and the way they honored the water sources that sustained them. John realized that this knowledge could benefit not only his ranch but the entire region. By learning from the Apache, he could ensure that resources were preserved and shared, even in the harshest conditions. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John and the Apache gathered around a small fire. The flames cast long shadows on the desert floor, and the air was cool after the heat of the day. They spoke quietly, sharing stories of the past, hopes for the future, and the lessons they had learned from each other. John felt a sense of belonging he had never known. The Apache had become more than allies. They were family in a way that transcended bloodlines. They had taught him courage, patience, and the importance of seeing the humanity in others, even those considered enemies. Not everyone approved of John's approach. Some settlers continued to spread rumors, warning that the Apache could not be trusted. Yet, John remained steadfast. He understood that fear often stems from ignorance and that by fostering understanding, he could prevent unnecessary conflict. The Apache, in turn, respected John's consistency and honesty. They knew that he would not betray their trust or exploit their generosity. This mutual respect created a sense of stability in a region where uncertainty had always been the norm. As the seasons changed, a new challenge emerged. Heavy rains threatened to flood parts of the plains, endangering both livestock and homes. John and the Apache worked tirelessly to reinforce dams, dig trenches, and move animals to higher ground. Their cooperation was seamless, a testament to the trust that had grown between them. The settlers who had once doubted John's judgment watched in awe as he and the Apache navigated the crisis with skill and calm determination. The flood passed with minimal damage, a victory achieved not through conflict, but through planning, knowledge, and collaboration. John often reflected on the lessons of these months. He realized that survival in the desert was about more than water or cattle. It was about relationships. It was about recognizing that every life, human or animal, had value, and that helping others could create a ripple effect far beyond one ranch or one season. He understood that true courage was measured not by force or confrontation, but by the willingness to act with integrity and compassion, even when it was difficult or unpopular. Through it all, John and the Apache continued to grow closer. They shared more than resources. They shared trust, knowledge, and hope. John taught them some of the techniques he used to maintain his ranch, while they taught him ways to move more efficiently across the land and make the most of scarce resources. Together, they created a system of mutual support that benefited everyone, human and animal alike. Their partnership became a model for what could be achieved when fear was replaced by understanding and cooperation. By the end of this period, John Carter had transformed not only his ranch but the surrounding community. Settlers began to see the Apache not as enemies, but as partners. The Apache began to see the settlers as people who could be trusted, rather than threats. The lessons learned through patience, kindness, and mutual respect had begun to reshape the relationships in the region. What started as a simple act, offering water to those in need, had grown into a profound example of humanity at its best. John knew the work was not finished. Challenges would continue to arise, droughts, storms, disputes, but the foundation of trust and cooperation he had built could withstand many trials. He also knew that his story was only part of a larger story, that when people choose empathy over fear, courage over suspicion, and understanding over conflict, they can change the course of lives in ways that few can imagine. The bonds he had formed with the Apache were proof that even in the harshest environments, hope and compassion could flourish. One evening, as John watched the sun sink behind the hills and the Apache warriors ride back to their lands, he felt a quiet pride. Not pride in wealth or property, but pride in the relationships he had nurtured. He understood that the true value of life on the plains was not in the land itself, but in the connections people made, the trust they built, and the courage they showed in moments that truly mattered. The story of John Carter and the Apache was still unfolding, but already it had begun to change the way people thought about survival, community, and what it meant to act with humanity. The seasons on John Carter's ranch changed slowly, but life never truly stood still. Even after months of cooperation and understanding, the land remained a place of constant challenge. Summer had faded into autumn, and the air was cooler, yet the desert was still unforgiving. John woke each morning to the faint sound of cattle moving in the pens, the soft rustle of the wind through the dry grass, and the occasional call of a distant bird. His daily routine was demanding, but he had grown used to it. Every day required thought, effort, and care, not just for his own survival, but for the well-being of everyone around him. One morning, as he checked the water troughs and inspected the fences, John noticed something unusual. A group of strangers had been spotted on the distant hills, moving cautiously but with purpose. They were not from the Apache tribe, nor were they familiar settlers. John sensed tension in the air. In the past, strangers in these parts often meant trouble, raids, disputes, or arguments over resources. But John also knew that fear could cloud judgment and lead to mistakes. He needed to act carefully, balancing caution with compassion. He called the Apache warriors to his ranch, explaining what he had seen. Together, they watched the group approach. There were 5 men, weary from travel but not hostile in appearance. John quickly realized they were travelers seeking help. The drought had driven many people from their homes, leaving them desperate for food, water, and shelter. This was a test of everything John had learned about trust, courage, and kindness. He could ignore them, send them away, or offer aid and risk the disapproval of neighbors. But John's heart told him what to do. He met the strangers at the edge of the property, offering water and guidance. At first, they were cautious, unsure whether John's intentions were genuine. But he spoke calmly, clearly, and without fear, and slowly their tension eased. He showed them the water troughs, explained the condition of the land, and invited them to rest while they planned their next steps. The Apache stood nearby, observing respectfully and offering advice when needed. Their presence helped establish trust, showing that John was not alone and that cooperation could exist between different communities. Over the next few days, the newcomers began to understand the delicate balance of life on the plains. They saw John and the Apache working side by side, moving cattle, digging water holes, and sharing resources without argument. It was a remarkable sight. The outsiders, initially cautious and fearful, began to learn that trust could replace suspicion, and that collaboration could solve problems that might otherwise have led to conflict. John became a teacher and a guide, demonstrating that courage was not about confrontation, but about acting with wisdom, empathy, and integrity. One afternoon, a crisis struck. A small fire had started near the dry grasslands, likely caused by lightning or friction in the heat. The wind spread the flames quickly, threatening the ranch, the cattle, and the nearby areas where the Apache had camped. Panic could have spread, but John remained calm. He organized everyone, directing the settlers, the Apache, and his own ranch hands to contain the fire. Together, they dug trenches, created fire breaks, and guided the animals to safe areas. The strangers learned quickly under John's leadership, following his instructions with trust and respect. The fire was dangerous and exhausting work, but through teamwork, they managed to prevent a disaster. The cattle were safe, the ranch was protected, and the Apache's temporary camps were unharmed. John's heart swelled with quiet pride, not for himself, but for what had been achieved together. He understood that courage was measured not by what one faced alone, but by what could be accomplished when people worked together, putting aside fear and distrust. The fire had been a test, and through cooperation they had passed with strength and unity. After the fire, the group sat together under the evening sky. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. They shared simple meals of bread, dried meat, and water. Stories were exchanged around the campfire, blending the voices of settlers, Apache warriors, and travelers who had once been strangers. John listened carefully, fascinated by the lessons in courage, endurance, and humanity. He realized that life on the plains was about more than survival. It was about relationships, trust, and the small acts of kindness that could ripple across communities. The outsiders, who had initially been wary, began to respect both John and the Apache. They saw firsthand that a single person's courage and compassion could influence others, creating peace where there had once been fear. The Apache, too, observed how John treated the travelers with fairness and respect, without judgment or prejudice. Their trust in him grew, solidifying bonds that had been forming for months. What had begun as a simple act of offering water had evolved into a network of respect, understanding, and cooperation that extended beyond one ranch. In the following weeks, John worked tirelessly to ensure that this fragile harmony could be maintained. He helped the travelers find temporary places to stay, coordinated with the Apache to manage resources, and continued to care for his own ranch. Each day brought new challenges. Drought conditions persisted, cattle occasionally fell ill, and disputes arose, but John approached every obstacle with calm determination. He had learned that leadership was not about dominance or fear, but about guidance, patience, and the ability to see the bigger picture. The Apache shared their knowledge freely, teaching the newcomers how to conserve water, navigate the desert, and care for animals in difficult conditions. John marveled at their generosity, realizing that true strength often lay in understanding and supporting others. By combining his own knowledge of ranching with the Apache's understanding of the land, they created solutions that would have been impossible alone. Cooperation had transformed what could have been a dangerous situation into a remarkable example of human resilience and unity. One day, as John surveyed the land from a hilltop, he saw the ripple effects of their cooperation. Nearby ranchers, who had once feared or distrusted the Apache, were now asking for advice on how to manage resources without conflict. Travelers who had once approached cautiously now sought guidance and friendship. Even distant communities began to hear stories of the rancher who had shared water and built trust with those once considered enemies. John realized that his actions were no longer confined to his own property. They were influencing the wider world in ways he could never have imagined. Despite the growing recognition, John remained humble. He did not seek fame or reward. His motivation was simple. He understood the value of life, of community, and of trust. Every choice he made was guided by the belief that helping others was the right thing to do, even when it was risky or unpopular. The Apache respected him not because of what he owned or controlled, but because of who he was, a man of integrity, courage, and kindness. Their friendship had become a bridge between two worlds, demonstrating that fear and misunderstanding could be replaced by trust and cooperation. As autumn deepened, a new threat loomed in the distance. Rumors spread of groups seeking to take control of resources in the region, potentially causing conflict. John knew that his work was far from over. But he also knew that the foundation of trust and cooperation he had built with the Apache and the travelers could withstand challenges. The lessons of patience, empathy, and shared responsibility had become deeply rooted, preparing them for whatever might come. One crisp evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills and the desert was bathed in soft golden light, John reflected on everything that had transpired. He thought about the small act that had started it all, offering water to those in need, and how it had grown into a force of unity and hope. He understood that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and persistent. It was found in the choice to act with integrity, even when others doubted, and in the willingness to extend trust where fear had long dominated. The Apache gathered around him, sharing laughter and stories, and even the travelers joined in. In that moment, John realized that life on the plains had changed, not because the drought had ended or the land had become easier, but because people had learned to see each other as allies rather than enemies. Cooperation had become a shield against hardship, and friendship had become a force stronger than fear. John Carter, the quiet rancher who had once simply offered water, had become a symbol of hope and humanity in a land that had often known only struggle. By the end of this season, the bonds between John, the Apache, and the settlers had solidified. They worked together, protected each other, and shared knowledge that ensured survival. The simple acts of compassion that had begun months earlier had grown into a legacy of understanding that would continue long after the drought had passed. John had proven that even in the harshest conditions, courage, trust, and empathy could create safety, harmony, and hope. And so life continued on John Carter's ranch. The desert remained challenging, the sun still hot, and the land still unforgiving, but a quiet transformation had taken place. Relationships had changed, trust had been established, and lives had been touched in ways that could not be measured in money or land. John's story was far from over, but the seeds of compassion he had sown promised a future where understanding could triumph over fear, and where even the most unlikely friendships could shape history in ways no one could have predicted. The winter on John Carter's ranch arrived. Quietly, with cooler winds and long evenings that stretched into the darkness. The desert, which had been harsh and unforgiving throughout the summer and autumn, now seemed calm, almost reflective. Yet John knew that life on the plains was never truly easy. Every day brought new challenges: frozen water troughs, restless cattle seeking warmth, and the constant vigilance that life in such a remote place required. Even so, John felt a deep sense of peace. Months of hard work, cooperation, and understanding had begun to bear fruit, and he could see the results all around him. The Apache warriors continued their visits, now more frequent and less cautious than before. Their relationship with John had grown into a bond of trust, respect, and friendship that extended beyond mere survival. They worked together seamlessly, moving cattle to better grazing areas, ensuring that water was carefully managed, and sharing knowledge of the land. Travelers and neighboring settlers had come to recognize the ranch as a place of refuge and learning, where disputes could be resolved without violence, and where cooperation was valued above all else. John marveled at how a simple act, offering water during a drought, had grown into something so meaningful and far-reaching. One morning, as John prepared the cattle for the day, a group of settlers approached the ranch cautiously. They had heard stories of John's cooperation with the Apache and were curious to see it for themselves. At first, they were hesitant, unsure whether the tales were true or exaggerated. But as they watched John and the Apache work side by side, guiding cattle, digging trenches, and sharing resources, their skepticism began to fade. They realized that trust and respect could coexist even in a land that had long been defined by fear and conflict. Slowly, they joined in, helping where they could and learning from John's calm, deliberate example. This growing cooperation became a turning point for the entire region. Other ranchers and settlers, who had previously viewed the Apache with suspicion or hostility, began to reconsider their assumptions. They saw firsthand that understanding and compassion could prevent conflict and save lives. John did not seek recognition or praise, yet his actions spoke louder than words. He had shown that empathy and courage could change not only individual lives, but also the entire community. The Apache, travelers, and settlers now worked together in a way that had once seemed impossible. One particularly cold day, a traveler arrived at the ranch, exhausted and nearly without hope. His horse was thin, and his supplies were nearly gone. John welcomed him without hesitation, offering food, water, and warmth by the fire. The Apache assisted in tending the horse and preparing a safe place for the traveler to rest. As the man recovered, he shared stories of distant lands and hardships he had faced. John listened intently, offering guidance and advice. The traveler left with renewed strength and gratitude, carrying with him the lessons of cooperation and kindness he had witnessed at John's ranch. John often reflected on the months that had passed. He thought about the drought, the challenges of survival, and the difficult decisions he had made along the way. But most of all, he thought about the people who had become part of his life. The Apache warriors who had once been considered enemies, the travelers seeking refuge, and the settlers who had learned to trust and work together. John realized that his true legacy was not the land he owned or the cattle he raised, but the bonds of friendship, trust, and understanding that had been built through patience, courage, and compassion. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, John sat by the fire with the Apache warriors. The flames flickered and danced, casting shadows on the desert floor. They spoke quietly, sharing memories of the past months, lessons learned, and hopes for the future. John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had discovered that true courage was not measured by battles won or possessions acquired, but by the willingness to act with integrity and kindness, even when it was difficult or risky. The Apache, in turn, expressed their gratitude, sharing stories of how John's actions had changed their view of settlers and strengthened their trust in humanity. As winter continued, John's influence spread further. Neighboring communities began to adopt his approach, learning to work with the Apache and each other to manage resources and prevent conflicts. Water sources were shared more carefully, cattle were guided cooperatively across the plains, and disputes were resolved with dialogue and understanding. The lessons John had demonstrated through simple acts of generosity had multiplied, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond his ranch. He had shown that even in the harshest conditions, compassion and courage could shape the course of history. Despite the growing respect and recognition, John remained humble. He did not seek to be remembered as a hero or a legend. For him, the value of life was measured in daily choices, how one treated neighbors, animals, and the land. He continued his work diligently, ensuring that the ranch thrived, that the Apache had access to water and resources, and that travelers and settlers could find help when they needed it. Every act of care, no matter how small, reinforced the bonds that had been built and ensured that the lessons of trust and cooperation would endure. One day, John received news that a young boy from a distant settlement had arrived, seeking guidance. The boy had heard the stories of John's courage and kindness and wanted to learn how to manage his own small ranch. John welcomed him warmly, teaching him the skills of ranching, the importance of patience, and the value of empathy. He also introduced the boy to the Apache warriors, showing him how cooperation and understanding could create strength where once there had been fear. The boy left months later not only with knowledge of the land, but also with a deeper understanding of humanity and responsibility. As the years passed, John Carter's story became part of local history. People spoke of the rancher who had offered water to those once considered enemies, who had taught settlers and Apache alike that trust, compassion, and cooperation could transform lives. His legacy was not written in newspapers or books, but lived in the hearts and actions of those he had touched. Families remembered his guidance, travelers carried his lessons across the plains, and the Apache passed on stories of the man who had treated them with respect and fairness. John's final years were marked by quiet satisfaction. He continued to work the land, tending cattle and maintaining water sources, always mindful of the delicate balance of life on the plains. He remained a friend to the Apache, a guide to travelers, and a trusted figure in the local community. Though the desert remained harsh and unpredictable, John knew that the bonds he had formed, the trust he had nurtured, and the acts of kindness he had performed had created a legacy far greater than land, cattle, or wealth. One peaceful evening, as John watched the sun set behind the distant hills, he reflected on his life. He thought about the first time he had offered water to the Apache warriors, the small act that had begun a journey of trust and friendship. He realized that courage was not only about facing danger, but about acting with integrity, even when the outcome was uncertain. Compassion could overcome fear, and a single choice could ripple through time, touching countless lives in ways one might never see. John Carter passed away quietly, surrounded by the land he loved and the people who respected and cared for him. His story lived on, remembered not for wealth, possessions, or power, but for the simple, life-changing act of generosity that had grown into a legacy of hope, courage, and humanity. The Apache, settlers, travelers, and neighbors all carried his lessons forward, proving that understanding, trust, and compassion could change the course of history in even the most challenging of places. Years later, children would play near the same water troughs that John had once shared with the Apache. Families would tell stories of the rancher who had taught them that kindness was more powerful than fear. Travelers would recount how a single act of generosity had inspired them to act with courage and empathy. And in the heart of the desert, the spirit of John Carter lived on, a reminder that one person, through simple, compassionate choices, could shape the lives of many, creating peace where once there had been only struggle. John's story was more than history, it was a living lesson. It showed that humanity, when guided by empathy and courage, could overcome fear and misunderstanding. His life was proof that even in the harshest conditions, trust, cooperation, and kindness could create lasting change. And that, above all else, is what made John Carter's story timeless, a testament to the power of one person's choices to transform the world around them forever.